Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest, Foreign Policy Bi-Monthly, and my guest today is John Mearsheimer. John, is Barack Obama a closet realist?
I think that he is, at this point in time, basically a realist. I think you wouldn't know it by looking at his policies. And I think the main reason is that he's hamstrung. I think that Obama is embedded in a national security establishment that has very clear views on how the world works, that I believe are at odds with his basic instincts at this point in time. I think if Obama had his way, he would have not upped the ante in Afghanistan. He would not have had an Afghanistan surge. I think he would have left both Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't think he would have done Libya. And you saw this summer he was not interested really in doing Syria. I think Obama understands that all these interventions have not been good for the United States. And that's the basic realist view. On the other hand, he is interested in keeping the United States involved on the world stage. He is interested in the United States remaining the most powerful state on the planet, and that's all in keeping with realism as well. So I think he is basically a closet realist, but he is so thoroughly constrained by the establishment here in Washington that he can only let his true colors come out to a limited extent.
Was the last president who really had control of the Pentagon, the military, what we call broadly the national security state, was it Dwight D. Eisenhower?
I think that's probably correct. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that Eisenhower was a military man. He had been a five-star general during World War II, and he'd been Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and he therefore commanded tremendous respect in the military and in the national security.
And he was the last to actually cut the military budget,
yes,
if I remember.
Yes, in a big way. We had some cutting of the military budget at the end of the Cold War,
sure,
but he was a person who cut it during the height of the Cold War. But the other thing about Eisenhower is that he became president in the early stages of the Cold War. Truman, of course, was the first Cold War president, but he was then succeeded by Eisenhower. And the national security state that we now have, this powerful Pentagon that we now have, did not exist then in the way it does now. So Eisenhower and Truman before him had a lot more leeway in cutting the defense budget and getting tough with the military. Now this establishment is so big, and there are so many people who operate here in Washington in the business of national security that it's just much harder for a president to cut against the conventional wisdom on any particular issue.
Is part of the problem, and this might change with the Afghan and Iraq wars, that we don't have presidents anymore who have served in the military? Barack Obama has not served. Bill Clinton didn't really serve. George W. Bush, you can't really call that service either. Right. Not do they lack the credibility and confidence to stand up to military demands for increased budgets?
I think all things being equal, it matters a bit whether a president had military service. I mean, Eisenhower is an exceptional case because he didn't just have military service. He was a five-star general, and he had made the sorts of high-level decisions that one would associate with presidential decision-making. So he had credibility that you're hardly ever going to find in another president. But I think military service does help somewhat. But as we saw with John Kerry in the 2004 campaign, that military service didn't help him very much at all. In fact, one could argue that it hurt him. I think the key is that you have a leader who has a lot of backbone, has a lot of support within his or her party, and is riding high in public opinion. And I think in that circumstance, even a president without a lot of military experience can wield an enormous amount of power. Probably the best case of that is Franklin D. Roosevelt, who did not serve in the military, but during World War II wielded enormous power.
When you look at the debates over Iran and China and American foreign policy today, do you have a sense of deja vu all over again? In the early 1970s, when Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger pursued détente with the Soviet Union, the opening to China, they were denounced both among neoconservative Democrats and from the right among Republicans. And Kissinger was completely baffled by the amount of antipathy that he and Nixon were engendering by trying to formulate a more realistic approach to foreign policy.
Right.
Today, Barack Obama, once again, neocons and their Democrats are attacking him, and then you have conservative Republicans attacking him as a sellout on Iran. Does anything ever change in Washington debates, or is it just the same thing over and over again?
The names of the countries change. Well, I think that there are always going to be cases where you have a country that the right intensely dislikes, and the more moderate forces in the country dislike but are willing to bargain with and reach some sort of accommodation, for fear if you don't do that, you'll have an endless arms race and possibly a war. This was certainly the situation with the Soviet Union. It wasn't that Henry Kissinger liked the Soviet Union. He didn't like the Soviet Union. He just believed that we had to have a prudent foreign policy that contained it and went to enormous lengths to avoid war. But as far as the right was concerned, any form of an agreement with the Soviet Union was the equivalent of appeasement. The right, as you know, this is especially true of neoconservatives, tend to view the world through the lens of the Munich analogy. And they view all of our adversaries as Adolf Hitler, or the second coming of Adolf Hitler. And they think that you don't bargain with Adolf Hitler, you deal with him in one way, and that is you put the mailed fist in his face and you ultimately arms race and defeat him. So I think with the Soviet Union and with Iran, you see tremendous resistance on the right-hand side of the political spectrum to reach an accommodation that will allow Iran to live another day, or in the case of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, to allow the Soviet Union to live another day.
President Obama drew a red line on Syria. Then the British Parliament said no. The American Congress might well have said no. Vladimir Putin probably pulled his chestnuts out of the fire. We didn't bomb Syria. There was widespread opposition to the idea among the American public. Did this mark a turning point in American foreign policy?
I think there's no question that the White House, and I think Washington more generally, the establishment here in Washington, was genuinely surprised by how much resistance there was in the body politic to using military force against Syria. And I think Obama would have liked to have done that in a very limited fashion, for sure, but he would have liked to have done it and gotten it over with. But he quickly realized that that was not possible. Now the $64,000 question is whether that will be the case again in some future potential conflict situation. Say we think about bombing Iran. We don't reach an accommodation with the Iranians, and they continue to enrich uranium, and great pressure is brought to bear on President Obama to use military force. Will he begin to countenance using military force and then run into resistance from the public? My sense is, and it may be wishful thinking on my part, he will run into significant resistance. And it's not just the public, it's that you have a lot of elites on the left-hand side of the political spectrum, and even some on the conservative side of the political spectrum, who have come to the conclusion that enough is enough, no more wars. And it could be that that would prevent Obama from using force against Iran. I know a number of strong supporters of Israel who believe, they will not say this publicly, but they believe that when push comes to shove, Obama will not use military force against Iran, and he will not suffer in public opinion because the body politics sense of the efficacy of military force has changed. But whether that happens remains to be seen.
This leads perfectly to my final question. Senator Rand Paul mused in the New York Times, quoted yesterday, as saying that it would be interesting or ironic if he were the Republican candidate against Hillary Clinton, that she would in fact be more pro-war and he would be the anti-war candidate. Does that suggest to you that things really could be changing in the Republican Party as far as its approach towards international affairs, or that an older tradition of realism might re-manifest itself?
Yeah, I think the operative word is could. It could suggest a change. I mean, really what's going on here is that inside the Democratic Party, you have a powerful liberal imperialist wing. And I would put Hillary Clinton in this category. And I think in this regard, getting back to your first question, Hillary Clinton is different than Barack Obama. I think Barack Obama is much more of a moderate on foreign policy, much less of an interventionist, much more of a realist. I think Hillary Clinton and the people she surrounds herself with have liberal imperialist tendencies, and they like to use military force. And I think most people believe that when Obama steps aside, that thread in the Democratic Party, that liberal imperialist thread, will remain very strong with Hillary Clinton. In the Republican Party, on the other hand, you've long had this battle between more traditional conservatives and neoconservatives. And up until recently, the neoconservatives were basically in the driver's seat. And that was certainly true when George W. Bush was the president. I think one could make an argument that what's happened is that the neoconservatives are in real trouble, and the Rand Pauls of the Republican Party are in the ascendancy. Now that remains to be seen whether that happens. But there is a lot of evidence that it's really kind of an isolationist strand in the Republican Party. As you know, isolationism was a very powerful force in the Republican Party during the 1930s and even in the 1950s. Remember Robert Taft. And I think Rand Paul, I'm not saying that he's an isolationist per se, but he has powerful tendencies in that direction. I think a case could be made that what's going to happen is that that group will at least be a powerful counterforce against the neoconservatives and maybe even dominate.
John, thank you for, as always, a fascinating interview.
You're welcome, Jacob.